Many years ago, when Jesus was taken on that Friday and murdered, as he was being laid in the tomb, the Jews would be celebrating their Passover, their remembrance of their deliverance from Egypt. You and I remember this as our deliverance from our own sin. As the Jews were in bondage to the Egyptians, we have been in bondage to sin. And as they were held prisoner, so are we. As they were delivered, so are we. But with a price. Their price was the price of the firstborn. Ours was the price of the only born. And so let me read for you from John, and I'm going to take a little bit from Matthew as we consider the cross. Now, as I said, it's important for us to understand that he died, and so what we're going to take a look at is his death. And then we will bring it down to three classes of people who recognized his death. We were not there, so we must rely on the historic record. So in John's Gospel, we find these words in John chapter 19. Then he delivered him up to them, that he might be crucified. Pilate delivering Jesus over to the soldiers who would crucify him. And they, the soldiers, took Jesus and led him away. And bearing his cross, he went out to a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew Golgotha. There they, the soldiers, crucified him, and two others with him, one on either side, and Jesus in the middle. And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross, and the writing was Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And his mother stood by the cross of Jesus, and his mother's sister, and Mary, the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. And after these things, after his crucifixion, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, for fear of the Jews, begged of Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave permission. Then he came and he took the body of Jesus, and Nicodemus also came, who at the first came to Jesus by night. And he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 pounds. And they took the body of Jesus, and they wound it with linen and with the spices, as is the custom of the Jews to bury. And in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been placed. And on the next day, which was after the preparation, I'm reading from Matthew now, Matthew's Gospel, chapter 27. The chief priests and the Pharisees gathered to Pilate, saying, "Sir, we remember that deceiver said while he was living, 'After 3 days I will again arise.' Then commanded that the tomb be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to the people that he has risen from the dead. So the last error will be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a watch. Go and make it as secure as you can." And going, they made the tomb secure, sealing it with a stone and setting a guard. Now, as I shared with you before, the thought that there are three classes of people that we are going to look to validate the fact that he is dead. After all, if Jesus is not dead, you are not saved. If Jesus is not dead, there is no resurrection, and Easter is a hoax. And if Jesus is not dead, then you and I have been perpetuating a lie. So let's consider then these three classes of people and what they have to say and why they may have said it. First of all, I draw your attention to those who loved him. Two men in particular I draw your attention to. Of course, you saw Mary and the women that were there. John was there. There are a great number of disciples there. But when it was all said and done, there were 2 disciples, secret, perhaps they were, but in the moment of need, they revealed themselves. And they provided something that God had promised would be done. See, Jesus, it was said, would be appointed his death with the poor. After a crucifixion, the body was usually just thrown into a common grave and there buried with all the rest of the murdered. It was appointed for him to be buried with the poor. But in his death, he was buried with the rich. And so, although he died and it was expected that his body would be tossed into a common grave, at the very last moment came 2 men who did not, I believe, understand that they were fulfilling any kind of a prophecy. They were just doing what was on their heart to do. 2 rich men. 2 men who were secret disciples of Christ. One we meet in John chapter 3. Another we meet only here, Joseph of Arimathea. He takes at his own expense and at his own peril. He approaches Pilate on this day and asks of Pilate if he might have the body of this crucified one. It could have been that Pilate could have condemned him as well. After all, what was he planning? Some sort of an uprising? So with courage in hand, he goes to Pilate, and we're told that he begged the body of Jesus. As he's given permission, I don't know where Nicodemus was standing or how he even heard that this man had gotten permission, but he hears about it. And somehow along the way, he joins up with Joseph of Arimathea, and these 2 men, political men, important men in Israel, well known, I would suppose, both to the high priest and to Pilate. And they go to the cross. And there at the cross, they take down the body of Jesus. Now they've got to hurry because the sun is about to set and Passover is about to begin. And so quickly, Joseph remembers that he has a tomb nearby. A tomb that would be fit for a king. A tomb in which nobody has ever been placed. Jesus is taken to that tomb. Now, these are 2 men that love Jesus. And what is their conviction at that moment? They believe that Jesus is dead. How do I know they believe he's dead? They buried him. You would not bury a man who is not dead. You would not wrap him in clothes and pour 60 to 100 pounds of powder over his body and then continue to wrap. He would have been suffocated if he wasn't dead already, just by this mummification process that they were putting him through. When his body began to rot and began to stink, this perfume, this resin, this powder that they had wrapped him in would begin to smell all that much sweeter. This is the actions of 2 men who loved the Lord, but were convinced he was dead. Eyewitnesses. He begged the body of Jesus. He didn't beg for Jesus. He begged for the body of Jesus, which in itself speaks of his death. They take him down from a cross. I suppose if he was breathing, they would have noted it as they took his body off the cross. And then they carried his body to a tomb. They laid him in the tomb. They sealed the tomb. These men who loved Jesus thought he was dead. And that's important because, after all, the importance of Good Friday is that Jesus is dead. And so we have the testimony of 2 men who were disciples of Christ, who said, honestly, we believed he was dead. We believed it so much that we buried him. We anointed him. We prepared his body for burial. and we buried him in the customary Jewish fashion. He was dead. But just in case we say, well, because they're disciples, maybe they had some purpose or reason for trying to convince us that he was dead. Well, let's take a look at the second group of people then. Those who executed him. Now, what did they have to gain? Absolutely nothing. They were simply hired executioners. They were not religious Jews. They were not anti-Christian. They simply had a job to do. Pilate said to them, you take this man to Golgotha and you crucify him. So regardless of what they may have felt, they carried out their orders. They nailed him to the cross. They watched him die. And when Jesus breathed his last, one of them said, truly this was, as they watched him die, this was, past tense, truly this was the Son of God. Now, these men who nailed him, who were given orders by the high priests to break the legs of those on the cross that they might die, broke the legs of the first man. By breaking his legs, the man could no longer push up and take a breath. So in very quick fashion, without being able to breathe, he would have suffocated. They broke the legs of the other man. Coming back to Jesus, one of the Roman soldiers, whose job it was to execute, said, this man is dead already. So, being a good executioner and making sure his job was complete, he pierced his side with a spear. And piercing his heart, we're told that blood and water flowed out. This man, who is an expert, who has probably crucified hundreds of people, who knows what death looks like, he was a soldier, said he is dead. He is dead already, but just in case there's any question, I'll stab him in the heart. So this soldier then, who has nothing to gain, he's not a follower of Christ. He isn't necessarily a hater of Christ, although he did a very cruel act, but that was his job. He was carrying out his duty as a soldier. And he said of this executed man, he is dead. But if that's not enough, those who loved him and those who had no quarrel at all in it, who were just doing their job, let's consider those who hated him. Those who hated him. What did they say? And the next day, remember, they came to Pilate and said, remember what that deceiver said when he was alive. When he was alive. Not what he said yesterday, but what he said when he was alive. These Jewish haters of Christ knew he was dead. They, after all, stood at the cross and mocked him. They waited until he breathed his last. They witnessed the breaking of the legs and the piercing of Jesus' heart. And then the next day they said, listen, remember what that deceiver said when he was alive? We have to secure the tomb because his disciples might come and steal the body. You don't steal the body of a guy who's alive. He would run off on his own. But they didn't say lest he should come out and walk away. They said lest his disciples should come and steal his body. So we had those who loved him and they said he was dead. We had those who executed him and they said he is dead. And we had those who hated him and they said he is dead. We know this because they guarded the tomb. He was dead. Remember what he said when he was alive. They placed a guard, not to make sure that Jesus didn't come out. They placed a guard lest his disciples should come and steal his body. The testimony of his friends, he is dead. The testimony of his executioners, he is dead. The testimony of his enemies, he is dead. The conclusion being then on Good Friday that Jesus died. And that is essential for us to know and to believe in order to celebrate what is about to come and what is about to happen. I want to very quickly then draw you back for just a moment to John chapter 19:25. And his mother stood by the cross, and his mother's sister, and Mary the wife of Cleopas, and Mary Magdalene. And I want you to have this thought, because it is worthy to note that the faithful ones at the cross were women. How often it is said in Scripture, he gave power to the faint. In the weaker vessels, and women are often referred to as the weaker vessel, in the weaker vessel was the greater strength. Of all of his disciples, it was these few women who never left. They were there, we're told, when Joseph and Nicodemus would return, and they would assist in the taking down of the body. The weaker vessel was the greater strength. And so we celebrate with this one thought. But God commanded his love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us.